So let's talk about some additional faults here. And we're going to be moving up essentially from the knees into the spine. And what we see is some excessive spinal flexion or hyperextension. And so we primarily see this on the descent. The load looks to be too heavy, and we start to see some flexion in the upper back. And then we also see this manifest in too much extension of the spine as well. And that will kind of travel down, or we'll see it also some strange movement in the hips. One thing I do want to say is that when we see some of these faults, if it looks catastrophic, it is okay to stop them in the middle of their set, have them rack the weight up, and go through some of these cues that we're talking about. You don't have to keep letting them go. I would rather you stop them in the middle of their movement, rack the weight, and then have a discussion. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a disclaimer that it's okay to interrupt a set. I wouldn't tell them to rack it in the bottom of their squat per se, but once they stand up from that, have them rack it and go through that discussion. So in talking about spinal flexion and hyperextension, Dr. H, what are you talking about for cues here?
Yeah, first off, great point about not trying to fix this under the bar. Mm-hmm. It kind of goes back to our previous point about fixing some of this in the warm up or establishing some of these cues first before we get them under a bar. A lot of times, I mean, this is a tangent a little bit, but you hear a lot of anecdotal stories about people from high level powerlifting gyms, or people, new athletes who are coming into those gyms who aren't even allowed to get under a bar for 3 months because they're establishing proper technique first and learning how to build some base level of strength in the upper back and in the trunk, really, to be able to then start training. And that's not a bad idea, to establish a base level of strength first before we start loading the spine with the squat and the deadlift in this manner. That said, there are a couple different ways of approaching this. You kind of alluded to the idea of the athlete who is more neuromuscularly educated or well-trained. They may be able to respond to a cue under the bar. And in that sense, one of the things that we can do to fix this kind of, flexed thoracic spine, particularly here, an easy cue is chest up. It just kind of initiates a little bit of thoracic extension. Again, this is one for the more advanced. Chest up, you would hope that they would kind of correct into that more neutral position there. One of the other things I'll kind of highlight here is a setup issue, right? Sometimes this is just a fault in the setup where we haven't coached it properly at the initiation. And for example, we have the elbows too high, and that's causing a flexion of the thoracic spine. Okay. This is a setup issue where we need to get the elbows kind of more directly under the bar, or not directly under, but kind of back to this position here. So it could be a setup issue. It could be a quick cue that fixes it, saying chest up. The other thing, most likely, this is an issue of them simply not understanding how to establish neutral spine. So I'll kind of flip this back to you here, Levi, and this kind of illustrates our hyperextended spine. And kind of, again, you mentioned earlier, if we have, I said I'd flip it back to you. Let me cover this one real quick. But if we have this kind of, again, setup issue of too much lumbar extension and some thoracic hyperextension as well, one of the issues that you can see manifest here is actually the old term butt wink, right? If we start in this anteriorly tilted pelvic position and we run out of bony anatomy room to continue flexing the hip, and really that's what it is. A lot of times butt wink is said to be a hamstring flexibility issue. It may be in some cases, but in my experience, I see more of an issue with people just simply running out of room in the bony anatomy to continue flexing the hip without the pelvis rotating posteriorly. And you'll see that a little bit here with me, where I start in anterior rotation, and towards the bottom of the lift, you see the pelvis has to roll back underneath. And I'm going to want to avoid, anytime I'm under load, whether it's a squat, a deadlift, anything else, I want to avoid extraneous spinal movements, right? Even if we're kind of butt winking back to neutral, this position here is probably pretty close to neutral. But what we see is extension into neutral. There's still movement happening at the spine there. I want to avoid that. And so again, setup issues, cueing can take place. But for me, one of the major important pieces here would simply be coaching neutral spine. And so now I want to flip it to you. How do you coach neutral spine, Levi? And what are What are some of the approaches that you take there before I'll show this after you're done getting through yours?
Yeah, again, a lot of this is going to take place in the warm-ups for me. Ideally, there's very limited coaching once we're actually lifting. And so one of the warm-ups or movement prep exercises that I use, learned it from my mentors. And man, I think it changed my approach to training. Without going down into detail on that, it's as simple as using a dead bug. For me, the dead bug, the legs are extended for me. Sometimes you'll see a dead bug where the knees are bent at a 90 degree. I like to have those knees extended because I'm going to see some limitations in ankle dorsiflexion as well as hamstring flexibility and then strength in the trunk. That said, so you have context for the type of dead bug that I'll use, I'm using the floor as my tactile cue. So I'm giving them verbally the mechanical piece. I want you to have a long neutral spine. And then I might say, I want you to make sure that that your hand can't pass underneath your lower back. And then the actual tactile cue for that is their back touching the floor. But oftentimes,
so just to clarify, they're laying supine on the ground, correct?
Yes. So there is an assumption that you understand what a dead bug looks like. And again, I'm giving you my variation that I will use with the legs extended rather than the knees bent. But that said, yes, they're laying supine, their butt, back, and shoulders and head are in contact with the ground, which is essentially trying to create this long neutral spine. And so the beauty of the dead bug for me in comparison to something like a plank, which gets a lot of clout for being a core exercise and strengthening the core, is that it can still be difficult to find your spinal position with the plank because there's no tactile feedback for you. Whereas with the dead bug, you have the floor. If I can teach you to press your lower back into the ground, and you'll go into this with the rib cage and the hip position. If I can get you to press your lower back into the ground, I know you're achieving now a better neutral spine. So for the overly extended spine, where you would be able to pass your hand underneath your lower back, by pressing into the floor, you're again creating a neutral position. And then too much flexion, the shoulders would come off the ground. So I'd have you tactically feel your shoulders being in contact with the ground as well. And then also for neck position, rather than more going more towards the crown or superior on the head, it would be kind of the immediate posterior aspect of the head in contact with the ground.
Yeah. So again, that's a great illustration of how you can use something in the warm up or a position that you practice daily, right? To establish some of these patterns that we want to see when we actually start lifting. One of the other ways you can teach neutral spine, this is stolen from Dr. Kelly Starrett. This is the idea of essentially rib cage and pelvis alignment, right? If we get into a hyperextended thoracic spine, the rib cage and the pelvis, rather than being kind of in this parallel position, they're kind of opening up this way, right? Alternatively, if we have thoracic flexion or some type of lumbar flexion, we're getting at this. So we want the rib cage and the pelvis to be parallel. Okay, they can move together as we flex the hip, but we want to see kind of this parallel position, almost like the idea of, I really like this mental picture of two buckets of water, right? The rib cage is one bucket, the pelvis is another. We want them spilling in the same direction together rather than one spilling anteriorly and one spilling posteriorly. Okay, so when we see this, the hyperextension fault would look like that, where we see the rib cage tilting back, the pelvis tilting forward. Okay. And then the flexion fault coming this way. So, and then right in the middle there, that's the neutral position. It almost feels a little bit like a little bit of flexion, but it's kind of very similar to when you're coaching the dead bug of kind of pressing the lower back into the floor, right? Mm-hmm. So that's another way you can work with someone, allowing them to see kind of this mental picture. And perhaps this would be a secondary phase after you teach them how to do this in a dead bug. All right, now let's work on this in a standing position, since we're going to squat in a standing position, just to make sure that they can transfer what they've just practiced in the dead bug into this position, and then work on hip flexion from there, perhaps. So you can take this kind of step-by-step approach. If the client or athlete is perhaps not so kinesthetically gifted, mm-hmm. Or doesn't have quite that mind-muscle connection that a lot of new trainers or trainees don't have, that's okay. You take a step-by-step approach and chunk it up for them so that you can transfer these skills into the actual practice of the squat, for example, that we're looking mm-hmm. at.
And one last thing, sorry to drag this one out, but as a practitioner, as a strength conditioning coach, just because you have a good athlete does not mean they move well. There can actually be a lot of common faults that will then negatively affect them with their on-court, on-field performance. So your scope and your job is to make them move well in the weight room. And so if you're seeing these flaws, make sure that you are addressing them. Just because they're a good athlete, they're the best on the team or whatever, doesn't mean that these things should not be addressed.
Okay, so that will address, hopefully give you guys some ideas there for spinal faults and fixes. We're going to jump back at the knee and the hip again here for our next one.